and welcome to the final Masterworks concert of our season, which is called The Art of Symphony. And this is a kind of a multimedia project that we are doing in partnership with several artists from Colombia who are creating works of art based on the three pieces you're going to be hearing at this concert. These pieces of these artworks will be on display in the Jasper Gallery, which is located on the second floor at the Courier Center. So you can view these in person, up close, before the concert, after the concert, of course, during the intermission as well. But some of these works then will be projected on the wall as we perform these pieces. So I haven't seen these artworks yet myself, so I'm at the time of this taping, so I'm very much looking forward to see what these three very different works how they will inspire the artists and share those with you. I'm joining you today from one of the studios here at the South Carolina Public Radio, and I thank them for their support in letting us use this room today to tape this pre-concert talk. So the main work in the second half of this concert is the Symphony No. 5 by Dmitri Shostakovich. This is among the most performed symphonies composed during the 20th century. It was such a hit when it was premiered in what was back then what was called Leningrad, St. Petersburg, in 1937. Apparently the ovation after the final chord resounded lasted for like almost half an hour. Everybody was just so wildly enthusiastic about this symphony. And of course, this was a moment of triumph for Shostakovich as well, especially considering what he went through for like 2 or 3 years before the premiere of this symphony. This was quite a ride for Shostakovich during this. It was a very turbulent period in his life. So Shostakovich, he was already as a young composer. He was being considered one of the brightest young talents in any artistic field in Soviet Union. He had obviously composed several pieces, of course, the earlier symphonies, several ballets, cantatas, and so on. In 1934, he unveils this very controversial opera, Lady Macbeth. And it was, by all accounts, it's sometimes performed today. It's not a staple operatic repertoire like the Puccini operas or Verdi, Mozart, and so on. But you might hear us occasionally come across either a recording or performance of this opera. It is very musically. You can see in this opera, in Lady Macbeth, that Shostakovich was sort of going towards more avant-garde route in his work. So it's more dissonant. There's definitely there's a lot of tension, a lot of sarcasm, which you will hear in his other works later on too. But it became a sensation when it was first unveiled in 1934. Around the same time, a few years later, he was also working on another piece that you don't come across very often in concert halls, and that's Symphony No. 4. That's the work, of course, that predates the Fifth Symphony that you're going to hear. Symphony No. 4 actually was not performed until many years later for the reasons I will mention in a second here, but that also has some of the same DNA, musical DNA, as the opera Lady Macbeth. So again, very dense, much more avant-garde, lot of dissonance and so on. Very epic as well, and for a huge orchestra in that particular in that particular symphony. Well, it just so happens that this opera was so successful, it was having quite a long run of performances. Think like Broadway musicals, right? It's maybe, you do a many years of run of a particular musical that you could hear. So it was almost like that. So it was going on sort of for a long time. In 1936, I think precisely January 26, in 1936, Stalin decides to attend the performance of this opera. 2 days later, on January 28th, in the Pravda magazine, or the paper, which still exists, apparently, but there was a heading, like the top article for that day was "The Model Instead of Music." And it was not written by Stalin himself. It was unnamed, sort of an op-ed, if you would, just sort of really criticizing Shostakovich's opera, Lady Macbeth. And of course, this happens two days after Stalin attends the performance. So you could kind of guess where this was coming from. Basically, I can read the actual quote here, I think. It says, so the model instead of music, that was the big heading, described the music of this opera, basically said, quote, it tickles the tickles the perverted tastes of the bourgeois with its screeching, neurotic music. So that's sort of the way this was described. When we think about sort of what was happening in Soviet Union around this time, so starting really in 1934, but kind of coming into more of a full force here in 1936 was the Great Purge. And so this became sort of a moment of existential crisis in a way for Shostakovich. And when this all came out, his wife was pregnant with their first child. I think he was born in May of that year in 1936. And Shostakovich was so concerned that for a while he actually slept outside the house, like in the stairway outside of the house, just so that in case the authorities came to take him away and, Lord forbid, like send him to Siberian labor camp or something, or worse, that it would not disturb, like he was hoping that would spare his family if they arrest him sort of outside the house. They will make a big fuss with his wife, and so on. So this became, and Shostakovich himself had a few friends and colleagues. Some of them were musicians, some of them were different artists, philosophers, and so on, who were sent away as well. So he was thinking, well, all right, so what do you do at this point? His answer was this particular symphony, the Symphony Number 5, which he wrote and got premiered, as I mentioned, in 1937. Now, what's interesting, though, there are very sort of different opinions about what really happened here. What's interesting is just like 8 days after the publication of that article, op-ed, The Model Instead of Music, criticizing the opera Lady Macbeth, there was another article that came out only 8 days after. And it was criticizing also Shostakovich's, another piece by Shostakovich that just happened to be performed. But it's this ballet that's very much, it's the music of this particular ballet, I wouldn't call it anywhere close to Lady Macbeth. It's actually, it's more tame. It's more, and the whole topic of it, you would think the Communist Party would not have had any problem, in a way, with this particular ballet. But then also that ballet got criticized horribly as well. So did he have some enemies within the musical circles who were closer to Stalin or the ruling party, and maybe they were jealous of Shostakovich's success, especially with the opera? So were they trying to, in a way, frame him, use this scandalous opera really merely as an excuse to achieve that. We don't know. I mean, some people think that was the case just based on the fact that both a very scandalous opera and very tame ballet were equally trashed by these papers. Anyhow, so he responds in a way with this Fifth Symphony. And, when we think of Fifth Symphonies, of course, I guess, a lot of people, the most famous Fifth is probably Beethoven's Fifth, of course. And there are certain elements of that, sort of this, the conflict, the struggle, and resulting in ultimate triumph, if you would. That narrative is definitely visible, audible in this particular Fifth Symphony by Shostakovich, as well. It is an epic piece. It's 50 minutes long, in 4 movements, used as a huge orchestra, and what he does is in the first movement, Shostakovich, he was a master of just building something, building to a huge climax, but it's like a slow burn, so it's like slowly turning up the heat, if you would. So a big section of the symphony, starts quietly, slow, and over the course of a long span of time, he's going to increase both the volume and the tempo of this until it's this like frantic march. And then all of a sudden things will die away, and then a very lyrical, almost like mournful theme might emerge. That's sort of it's cinematic, really, in a way, how he treats these large forms, like architecturally speaking, through his composition. And so you will hear sort of the prime example of that. That's why I think it's also why this piece has been so popular. I think there's such an emotional and dramatic connection to both the performers and audiences that you don't really need to know much about this piece, but it's just the way he just builds his climaxes, and it's just sometimes just the climax is like almost like shattering, and then kind of contrast that with a very, very lyrical, very still, icy, in a way, that kind of landscape. I think there's something that I think listeners can really grab onto, and that's why I think this piece has become such a staple of as I mentioned, it's one of the most frequently performed symphonies from the 20th century. In the middle, you have sort of the second movement is a scherzo movement, and this is sort of where sort of the sarcastic, witty side of Shostakovich comes through. The little bit of the grotesque quality from the opera sneaks in here, but without so much dissonance. So I think it was okay, for the authorities. Then the third movement is this gorgeous slow movement. Really in this, most of the brass players actually sort of take a break during this movement, and he just again builds this almost like a Russian Orthodox funeral chant type of melody that starts in the strings and just keeps on building and building, again over a course of a long time. It's quite a journey, and then we get to this triumphant fourth movement, sort of a big march that starts, and again the way he marked instructions in the score for the last movement, it starts sort of in a moderate tempo, but then it just keeps on picking up. Every phrase, it's a little bit faster, a little bit louder, until it gets to this like a big climax, and then it dies down again. The horn will introduce this gorgeous theme, and then out of that comes out that first march theme you hear at the beginning of the movement, but it's actually stretched out. So it's like very slow and very quiet. And then from there, he's now going to do the one final build into this climax. So on the surface, at least, and this is where this is such an interesting piece because it was premiered in 1937. It's been performed so many times, and we still can't agree what this piece is about, because Shostakovich couldn't really, in a way, he felt like he couldn't really say what this piece was about. He did call it, I'm gonna quote it, the official stance, the official catchphrase, if you would, and Shostakovich kind of sanctioned this. Was the symphony was called a Soviet artist's reply to just criticism. So that's what he called it. But is that what it was? In a way, this got him back into the favor with Stalin and the Communist Party. He faces another crisis, actually, several years later. He kind of had like two periods in which he kind of fell out of favor with the public stance, for being accused for being too adventurous and too avant-garde for the taste of the Soviet Union. But this was sort of his way out of this first crisis. So, you can take it. I mean, what's beautiful about this piece, though, is that you could interpret it in many, many different ways. For instance, there are other Russian scholars who had written, and they were at the premiere of this symphony in St. Petersburg, and they were left thinking, however, that this triumphant ending was sort of fake in a way. They were slightly sort of, it seemed maybe too triumphant. They felt like this is there is something underneath this. So some of his close friends were already sort of doubting, what this piece was supposed to be about. And Shostakovich supposedly later says something to the effect about, the end of the symphony is sort of like, it's sort of like you're trapped in this tiny room and somebody's beating you over the head with a stick saying, your business is good, your business is good, your business is good. And eventually, you walk out of there, you're saying, yeah, my business is good, my business is good, my business is good. So apparently he kind of remarked that sort of the depiction of this last movement. And what's interesting is, in this piece, if you listen to earlier recordings, Bernstein recording, for instance, with the New York Phil, Ormandy, all of the former Soviet Union recordings from earlier, the way that the very end of the final climax in the last movement is played, you might notice that it's actually played quite fast. And then if you listen to, for instance, and I feel like I'm just going to give away the secret here, but if you listen to some of the modern present-day interpretations of this piece, it's actually a lot slower. And the reason for that is there was a first publication of this symphony that came out that had a very fast tempo marking at the end. So that's what everybody did. And when the new sort of, there's with Shostakovich, there's and with many composers too, but there's more updated, we call it urtext, sort of a more scholarly editions, if you would, of some of these major composers. Their works come out, and so Shostakovich's critical editions, the new scholarly editions, have been coming out over the last couple of decades. And if you look in the new edition, that the tempo indication for the last section of the symphony is basically half the tempo of how it was originally notated. So it's twice as slow, if you would, as how you were used to hearing, which gives a completely different sort of, I think it, when it was so fast, yeah, it sounds very, very triumphant, but then in a way almost empty in a way, just kind of almost silly, kind of borderlining kind of a silly, empty celebration or so. And then when you take it at the newly indicated tempo, it's actually kind of terrifying. It's not triumphant. It's a very tense. I mean, it's loud, but I feel like it's almost like unbearably like intense experience. And I don't know, so again, that's the new edition. Supposedly they consulted all these available sources. So they claimed that was Shostakovich's intent, which sort of goes with the meaning again of this symphony and the finale in particular. Is kind of interesting. Some people feel that the last movement is sort of a veiled parody, if you would, criticism of Stalin, like making a mockery in a way of Stalin. Some scholars, some listeners, and some performers have alluded to this. Another interesting thing to consider is that the very opening of the march theme in the finale comes from, there was a set of songs that Shostakovich was also working on around the same time as this symphony, and it was initially unpublished, but it's based on the poems by Pushkin. And he set a couple of these poems to music, and he kind of quotes self quotes himself a little bit. So the march theme, the opening of the march theme, apparently is the very same as the motif in the song cycle. The text underneath it is something about a barbarian artist. So that's kind of interesting. And then the very end here, the slow horn theme that comes in the middle of the last movement is the text there is very poignant text about sort of unwielding like faith and sort of having a compass, if you would, in the midst of storm, in the midst of adversity and storm and so on. So it's kind of interesting. Definitely a lot going into this symphony. But again, it's such a epic sound journey that is sort of I think it's it's one of those perfect pieces to end the season, for a grand finale, for a concert season, and to conclude with this epic symphony. I think it's the perfect way to go out for this current season. In the first half, again, we have very contrasting sort of pieces throughout this program. So we open with a very short, and it's a lovely piece by a Japanese composer, Karen Tanaka. And she was born in Tokyo, studied in Tokyo. Actually, she went to Toho School of Music, which is actually the alma mater of Seijozawa. That's where he went to school before he became a famous conductor, and it's still there. It's one of the major conservatories in Tokyo. And then from there, she actually studied in Paris for a while. And then for the last several years, she's been living in LA, in California, teaching film music and composition at the Cal Institute of the Arts. And so she has a very diverse sort of background. In Paris, she studied very avant-garde technique of sort of using, well, this is early days of computers, but sort of using computers, incorporating computers, so non-acoustic sounds into music, and that was a big thing, especially in Europe at the time. So she studied those very avant-garde techniques, but then she's written a lot of film scores, score for TV shows, and so on, and her style is quite diverse. The piece we're going to be playing for you is called Rose Absolute. And this is, as far as I know, might be the only piece, at least for orchestra, only orchestral piece that was commissioned to go with a perfume. So Rose Absolute was the name of the perfume, and by this French designer. And so Tanaka went to that boutique. Of course, had got to smell the scent of apparently it's, and I've never smelled this perfume, but as the name suggests, it's very there's a strong hint of floral quality from rose in this perfume, and she was inspired to write this short tone poem in a way with the same title for orchestra. And she actually called this, she said, it says, she describes this piece as a floral bouquet for a lover, as my personal romantic present. So you will hear this gorgeous theme that's sung in the strings. There's also a very sort of a celestial or dreamlike quality in this music by the use of the percussion instruments, the keyboard instruments, also playing these repetitive figures, but very high in the high register. So it's an incredibly sort of almost otherworldly piece. She sometimes will also incorporate sort of a echo method in a way, so she will have a same theme, but it's just staggered ever so slightly, so it sounds like an echo of each other. So it just kind of creates this kind of dreamy character, and so I'm very curious what kind of artwork our artists are creating in response to Karen's piece here. I got to work with her a few years ago with another orchestra. There's another gorgeous piece called Water of Life, and if you have a chance, check that out as well. Rose Absolute, I don't think there is a complete recording of this piece, but there is if you go to YouTube or Spotify, any of these sites, and if you Google Tanaka and Rose Absolute, there's like a big chunk of this piece. For some reason, it's not a complete performance, but a fragment of it is available. It's like a 5-minute fragment of this is commercially available or publicly available. So if you want to check it out, I would urge you to do that as well. And before the intermission, we have an incredible young cellist by the name of Sterling Elliott, who is coming to join us to play the virtuoso showpiece, and that is the Rococo Variations by Tchaikovsky. So here we have a Russian connection with Shostakovich that's in the second half of this program. Sterling, and I also know his brother Brandon Elliott as well. Brandon is a violinist, and Sterling is a cellist, of course, and they grew up in Newport News, Virginia, which just happens to be just sort of down the road from where we're living right now in Yorktown, Virginia. And he's currently making, I think next season he's making a debut with the Philadelphia Orchestra. Just before coming to play the Rococo Variations with us here in Columbia, he's going to be playing the same piece just a week before, 2 weeks earlier with the Minnesota Orchestra. So he's now making all these debuts with all the major orchestras around the country, playing a lot of chamber music and so on. I heard Sterling in person a couple years ago playing one of my favorite cello concertos, which is Haydn's second concerto, Haydn's concerto in D major, which if you talk to cellists, it's one of those concertos that they'll say it's actually one of the most difficult concertos to play, because it's just so refined, and it's very difficult, but you have to make it sound so effortless. And one missed note, everybody kind of notices it. It's that, it's that kind of piece. And I heard Sterling play the Haydn concerto, and I was just floored. So I got to meet him afterwards, and so he knew immediately then that we were going to bring him here to play with us. And so I'm very glad that we are able to do that. And Rococo Variations, this piece by Tchaikovsky, would be it's a perfect piece for anytime you have set of variations. I'm thinking of pieces like Rhapsody on the Theme by Paganini, for piano by Rachmaninoff, or this piece for cello, by Tchaikovsky. Variations, theme and variations, perfect vehicle to show off one's virtuosity, one's sort of a musical range, not just technique, but also the sense of, the poetic playing, the lyrical playing, all the contrasting materials, all tied to that same theme. The theme in this case, sometimes theme and variations are built, the theme itself is based on either a well-known theme. It could be, a famous composer, Henri Vuitton, actually has a piece for violin that's actually variations on Yankee Doodle. And it's quite a virtuoso piece for violin, for instance. But in this case, the theme is Tchaikovsky's original. But he wanted to create a theme that is sort of a reminiscent or homage to Mozart and sort of to the classical era. So that's what he did. And then there are ensuing variations that features the cello, sometimes in quite a virtuosic manner, sometimes in a very lyrical manner, and so on, to a conclusion. Speaking of Mozart, Tchaikovsky, it was a well-known fact that Tchaikovsky, he said, and this is his actual quote, that in a letter he wrote to somebody else, he says, "It is thanks to Mozart that I devoted my life to music. I adore and idolize him." So there's that sense of both the nostalgia for the sort of the ornate Rococo era, so to speak, but also sort of this tip of the hat to his idol, musical idol Mozart, in this piece as well. He wrote this actually in Tchaikovsky. It's interesting, we talk about it with Shostakovich. We talked a little bit about sort of the personal crisis, or the crisis as an artist, and how one would respond to it. In the case of Tchaikovsky, and he was a very, by all accounts, he always has self-doubt. I don't think he was a very confident. He had a lot of confidence in himself. There are a lot of pieces where we see so many different versions of the piece. Thinking of Romeo and Juliet, the famous overture for orchestra. For instance, there are like multiple versions of this, because what he would do is that he would write the piece and then it will be performed. Sometimes he would conduct it, sometimes it's conducted by somebody else. And then if there is a bad review, he goes back and then he's like, why didn't this work? So he sort of goes back and revise it and then unveil the revised version. If the reception was more positive, he might leave it at that. If the reception was still not good, he might go back the third time and tweak it and, maybe cut a few things, tighten up the structure, all of these things. Sort of, he will do these sort of revision work sort of in front of public's eyes, whereas other, some other composers might be, once the revisions are done, when the final product is finished, and when it's unveiled, regardless of the reception, that's the way. I mean, that's they believe that's the way they wanted it, and it's okay for them if the reception was lukewarm. In the case of Tchaikovsky, whenever there was a negative review or lukewarm reception of his new pieces, the first temptation was for him to tweak it and see if he can make it better or change some things to accommodate people's taste. So he wrote this started working on it in December of 1876. And sort of within the span of 2 weeks, he had unveiled a new opera, which was apparently a complete flop. And then he was receiving correspondence from his friends or colleagues around Europe, in Paris and Vienna, also of the aforementioned Romeo and Juliet, where one was blamed on somebody's bad conducting of it. Another was just simply a very influential music critic in Vienna just hated the piece. So he's getting all these reports from his friends abroad saying, yeah, that piece, Romeo and Juliet, not going so hot. So, he was sort of at this time, so, he was, in a way, he was very doubtful at this time of his ability as a composer. And how did he work through it? He just, actually, in this case, this time he decided to write something. So the piece he wrote was the Rococo variation that you are going to hear. So to write this, oftentimes when composers are writing concertos for solo instrument, especially concertos with solo instrument and orchestra, sort of more of a larger scale works, and let's say if you're not as familiar or well-versed on that particular instrument, you might work with, in this case, a cellist who obviously knows what's possible and what's impossible and what would work on the cello that's different from, piano, let's say. So Tchaikovsky here worked with a German cellist who was playing in he was a principal cellist in one of the orchestras in Moscow at the time by the name of Wilhelm Fitzenhagen. And so what's interesting about this collaboration, though, is that, and you hear about this a lot nowadays, even during COVID, actually, composers were still writing pieces for different instrumentalists and singers and so on, and using Zoom as a tool. So they could, email ahead a few phrases of a concerto, a new piece that they're working on, to the commission, the person who commissioned it or who will be playing the premiere. And, they will kind of consult over Zoom, right? And they say, okay, yeah, this is what's going to sound like. And, how about, this works well. How about, well, actually on the violin, I know what you're intending here, but it might not work as well because of the nature of the instrument and so on. So there's a, back and forth. Well, Fitzenhagen and Tchaikovsky had a lot of back and forth too. But I feel like in this particular instance, the cellist was really sort of the alpha here in some ways, to the point I think the cellist was really sort of dictating the order of the variations, sort of the overall structure, architecture of the piece, in addition to, of course, having a lot of input about the solo part, about the cello part. There's a funny story, and Tchaikovsky was obviously fine with it. He won it, especially I think coming on the heels of getting these bad reviews. I think he was, at that particular point, he was very much in that particular mode where he was, thinking, hey, well, I want to make this piece a success. So one way I could do that is making sure the soloist for this premiere feels very much comfortable with what I'm writing, and that, it makes most musical sense to him. So that's what he was doing. Well, apparently he didn't tell this to his publisher. So he gets this letter from his publisher saying, so we don't know who this Fitzenhagen guy thinks who he is, but do you realize that he's writing to us with corrections? Like, it's like he's changing what you're writing. And Tchaikovsky was like, oh yeah, he's got my approval to do that. So it was so funny. Even his publisher was like, wait, I think this cellist is changing your intent here, because he was so actively involved in making this piece. But the end result is it's one of the most popular cello concertos in the repertoire to this day. And so, and it's a perfect virtuoso vehicle for Sterling to share with us. And again, I'm very, for all these pieces really, for the art, the visual art aspect of this, I just can't wait to see what these incredible artists here in Colombia will come up with, and we can't wait to share that with you as well, of course, with this incredible array of music we have planned for our fantastic season finale coming up.